I was also able to hear a little bit of the conversations that you were having, and it sounds like, a lot of your topics are pretty complicated, right? There's a lot of parties and different groups involved. If you're talking about things such as like contested water, right, water supply and land, right, there's a lot of work here to look at what are the different groups, the history, the context, and so on, especially with things like physical space, property, and location. There's a whole lot to draw from in terms of just understanding the history and context of conflict. So a lot of the conflict guides that we've looked at, like Ware's conflict map, are really useful starting points. So one way of thinking about conflict is to think about, where did this conflict start? What is the origin or the spark that really made this conflict happen? Is this conflict happening in waves, right? Is it important and then kind of dying down and so on? There's a lot of conflicts that seem to ebb and flow a lot over the years, right? One really hot button topic right now is about the degree to which parents should be involved in K through 12 school boards, right? That was a huge point of contention and debate in last week's Virginia governor's race, right? There's also a lot of issues that are related to, again, things such as property, land, water rights, so on, that can be definitely topics that can change and adjust over time. So I definitely recommend as a good starting point thinking more about the history and context surrounding the topic. Remember as well that this is an essay that's not meant to be argumentative, it's not meant to convey your own opinion about the topic, but instead it's designed to understand and unpack the levels of conflict and issues going on surrounding your topic. So I don't want to hear like a persuasive essay and your opinion about this issue. I want to hear what is happening and what the different parties in the conflict are related to this issue. Another question came up about whether or not you could draw from or use topics from your study circle. You can use that as a starting point, but I definitely want you to push yourself a little bit on that topic further, right? So if you're talking about something like the minimum wage, you could expand that to suggest like the minimum wage in the state of Oregon, or the minimum wage for private or public workers, or something like that. Like try to develop the topic in kind of a unique or different way. And continuing to look at a lot of news headlines and topics in the news is a good way to start too. All right, there's a lot of debate and disagreement about the value of NFTs or non-fungible tokens right now, and how that might or might not be considered a good form of currency. So there's a lot of different areas that we can continue to look at, and I'm happy to field any other ideas if you're struggling on this assignment or trying to figure out your topic in a little bit more detail. Remember too, this is just going to be a rough draft that you turn in. It doesn't need to be perfect and fully developed. The point, the big goal in this class is to help you in revising and developing these writing skills more over time. So last class, we did some brainstorming for the paper, including some general ideas. We had this kind of calendar of the remaining weeks in the quarter and things you should expect in terms of upcoming assignments and so on. And we talked a little bit about anger and aggression, which is a topic that we'll be getting into a little bit more for today. So for today's class, I want to spend some time debriefing the midterm exam, talking about some of the major elements of bullying and aggression and conflict, and then looking at the case study of cyberbullying in the context of AAPI students and some of the efforts that they've taken to combat that particular form of bullying. So I showed this on Monday, but as a reminder, the remaining 4 full weeks of the class are playing out. So this Friday, we have a study circle, our last one of the group. For those of you who have already completed study circles, I wait until everybody has done those before I give your kind of formal feedback and grades on those. So once we have the last study circle on Friday, then I'll be starting to give you your grades and feedback on the 3 different parts. The participation you had in the study circle, the write-up that I asked you to complete within 2 weeks of your study circle, where you shared and talked about your process of participating in the study circle. And then finally, by the end of the quarter, I'm asking you to complete kind of 2 reviews of 2 other students. So in particular, make sure that you turn in that reflection on your participation in the study circle if you haven't already done so, and know that it's coming up. Keep on your radar those peer feedback forms as well, where I'm asking you to just kind of look through and reflect on 2 other study circles in the course. The recordings for those are available on Canvas and will be available for Friday. The other thing that I wanted to direct you to is the extra credit opportunity. So I mentioned on Monday that I have an extra credit opportunity available for you. One thing that I like to do for all of my classes is to provide extra credit. Basically, the way that I handle extra credit in this class is that there is one major extra credit opportunity. If you complete it, it adds a total of 20% or 2 points onto your grade, right? So if you are kind of on the fence, you can do great on the midterm, you're worried about your grade, it has definitely saved people who otherwise would not pass or get the grade that they need. If you're doing well and you want a buffer, you can complete it through that too. As an extra credit opportunity, I am asking you to go above and beyond a little bit in terms of what's being asked in the class. So this assignment is going to be due 1 month from today on December 10th. You don't have to do it, but if you do, you'll get those extra credit points. So what I'm asking you to do is to look at an example of a formal or professional conflict management or mediation service. So there's actually one in Eastern Oregon. It's like an Eastern Oregon conflict management. And there's a lot of other types of organizations that formally handle issues of conflict management, mediation, and so on. It doesn't have to be in Eastern Oregon. It can be wherever. It could be a larger national organization, be from another state, and so on. But what I want you to do is to do a little bit of research about this professional service or organization that's handling conflict management. So in particular, what are the types of conflicts that they deal with? What are the strategies that they're interested in dealing with conflict management as well? So as part of this assignment, one thing that I would ask that you do is to get in touch with this formal service. So you can send an email, you can also call them. But I front it by saying, hey, I'm a student in conflict management. I'm interested in learning more about how your organization deals with and engages with conflict. So I think it can be a little bit daunting and a little bit scary to reach out. But I think it's also a really fun, really interesting way for us to apply these things from the class too, right? So it's asking you to go outside of your comfort zone a little bit, but I think it will be really interesting to learn, what types of strategies and approaches some organizations might do to address conflict management in the formal way, right? Because there are a lot of different organizations and groups that directly deal with conflict, that handle conflict between groups, and that create kind of resources and principles to help people with managing conflict. If they say something like, well, we can't help you, or we have to charge you a consulting fee, you don't have to do that. You don't have to pay for something like that in this class. I just recommend reaching out elsewhere. Once you've done that and done that upfront research to learn more about the organization that you've selected, I'd like you to kind of talk about what you've learned from your contact with this conflict management service. Again, it could be an email. It doesn't have to be a super long conversation. Talk about the conflict management services and strategies that they offer that connect to the course. So maybe you learn that this is a group that's really focused on mediation and the third-party dispute process. Or maybe just like this class, you find a service that uses study circles. Fantastic. You can directly connect that to the course and the ideas we've brought up. Then lastly, you believe that this service is doing a good job of managing or dealing with conflict. Given the things we talked about in the class about what makes a good study circle and so on, are they doing these things? Or are there problems that you're seeing in the approach that they use for conflict management? So I'll ask you to share those thoughts in kind of a 2-page double-spaced standard font margins. Again, it is asking you to go out a little bit of your comfort zone, but I think it'll be a fun way for us to apply and use these ideas in the class should you choose to proceed with that activity. So I wanted to put that on your radar. The next thing that I want to talk about is the midterm exam. So as promised, by the end of the day on Monday, I posted the total scores that you have on the midterm exam, including the short essay along with the multiple choice questions. I also went ahead and added some specific feedback for you. So I gave you feedback on each short essay response that you have. Each of those was worth 33 points. When we added them together, to make 99 points plus one bonus point that everybody got, and made for a total of 100. The highest score in the class was 200 out of 200, or 100%, so I didn't curve the quiz or change the overall score on it. What I want to do is go through, I think, some of the trickier questions that people had a little bit more trouble with. But as I'm working through this, if there are any questions that you'd like me to go over, or you realize after class, hey, I don't really understand this question, can you go over it? I'm happy to help you and go over that with you. So these first three questions were examples of different ways of deconstructing conflict, right? Going back to the three different models that were discussed in chapter 4. So these three are Hawker-Wilmot, change-oriented conflict analysis, and here's conflict map, right? So Hawker-Wilmot is the best model for focusing on forgiveness and reconciliation. Remember, that's one of the major steps in this model. And Hawker-Wilmot is very much about trying to understand the emotional states and opinions and feelings that are guiding people in conflict, right? Hawker-Wilmot is very much about understanding emotions and playing into conflict. It could be a model that you could integrate into your essay if you feel like that's a really strong component on politically charged topics like environment, like abortion, so on. This can be a really useful tool. Lenny's model that focuses on social realities directly apply to change-oriented conflict analysis, right? One of the steps and parts of change-oriented conflict analysis is this idea of social reality. And social reality reflects the way that people in a conflict view conflict management as able to resolve or deal with problems, right? So based on your social reality, you might say, you know what, I think we can have a good solution here, we can work together, or I think that conflict management is dumb, I don't want to do it, so on, right? And then lastly, conflict regulation potential is a direct step of where's conflict. It's one of the things mentioned towards the end of that, and it tends to focus a lot more on the different interests of parties, and it's a good model to use if the conflict itself is a complex one, has a lot of different parties in use, right? So in these three questions, there's one model that's the best fit for specific steps that Lenny is looking for. So as a listener, right, Vanessa is acknowledging the hardships of her brother. So sympathetic listening is the best approach here, right? Sympathetic listening is about acknowledging or hearing the concerns of other people, right? It's the fact that you understand, oh, you're going through a difficult time, right? You're sympathizing with and realizing that they're in that situation. Empathic listening would go a step further, right? It would mean that Vanessa is putting herself in the shoes of her brother, is imagining the kind of frustration and pain her brother is going through, and so on. Because in this question, Vanessa is not taking that extra step, she's just acknowledging, sympathetic listening would be the best answer. So Luis, in the example on people speaking, is an example of active listening. So dialogic listening, right, comes from the idea of dialogue, right, of a conversation between two people. So dialogic listening, you're listening to respond and to participate. So if you've read, any of the ancient Greek stuff like Aristotle and Socrates, you know that Socrates loves asking questions over and over and being obnoxious. He's a dialogic listener, where that comes from. Contextual listening is more focused on situations. Active listening is involving just focusing on what people have to say and really understanding and comprehending the message that people do, right? Active listening is really paying attention, not to try to respond, but to understand what's happening. So Tia has an idea for company logo, but she's worried about coworkers not liking her idea, so she's self-censored. Keyword here, right, is self-censorship, right? The decision not to share or disclose a key piece of information, as we've talked about in the course, is one of the biggest symptoms of groupthink. So when you're in groupthink, you oftentimes choose not to share a view that's controversial, and you feel like people might disagree with, so on, right? So by not speaking out and being worried about rocking the boat, Tia would be engaging in groupthink here. Worst alternative to a negotiated agreement is not the best answer here because this isn't directly, right, a negotiation. It's about her having an idea and the self-censorship she's choosing in regards to sharing that idea. That would be the best response here. Right? A low context culture is direct. It's people who are communicating, saying what they mean. High context means that there's a lot more subtext, there's ambiguity, there's things that people aren't sure of, and might be lost in translation between cultures. Right? So if you were to use like a popular phrase like the early bird gets the worm, right? And a member of a different culture had never heard of that phrase before, then that would be an example of the importance of context for conflict management. Another example would be, the story of the frog and the scorpion, right? Where, the frog goes across the river, bites the scorpion up on its back. Scorpion stings him halfway through and says, "Hey, we'll both drown. Why did you do that?" Scorpion says, "It's my nature," right? That might not be as familiar of a story to Western audiences, making context really important. Tangible evidence, self-reports, and witness reports are the three tools that we use in order to construct conflict. So tangible evidence could be something like a legal document, like a tax report. Self-reports are you talking about the conflict yourself, and a witness report would be a third party. So destructive conflict is the best definition for losing sight of the original goals and focusing on harming each other. Worst alternative is instead the thing that happens if a group can't reach a negotiation, right? So worst alternative means if you can't reach an agreement, this will happen. It's not really focused on harming each other, but it's more focused on what will happen if we don't reach a solution. Conflict coaching. So conflict coaching involves doing things like creating rapport, creating a good relationship between people. One of the things that conflict coaching does, right, it typically involves parties creating a little map or list in their head of ways to solve or to address the overarching conflict. So conflict coaching is the best answer here. Groupthink is not executive pursuit of major issues. In fact, in many ways, it's the failure to do so. Compromise can definitely be used in the context of conflict coaching, but it doesn't really involve like an executive level dispute or third party who would be able to engage in the coaching itself. Study circle facilitators, right? Shouldn't be personal. It shouldn't be attacking or saying, this person is wrong, but it's instead about trying to attack the issues rather than the people. Single issue non-numerical bargaining, right? So the answer here is false because single issue non-numerical bargaining is tough, right? It's difficult because the different groups in question oftentimes have very different views on the topic. They don't feel similarly, they don't understand how to measure an issue in the same way, and so on. For example, if people are texting and they're dating and they say, let's talk to each other regularly. To one person, regularly could mean once a day. To another person, it could mean 20 times a day. Because you use the word regularly, maybe there's a disagreement and negotiation on the basis of what it means to regularly communicate with someone else. Because the numbers are not there in the way that they are with numerical bargaining, non-numerical bargaining is oftentimes harder. You have to have an agreement between parties on what the item is first. So it's not generally easy. It's not agreed upon in advance. Short essays. So short essays were pretty good. I was pretty impressed. People did a great job here with this Rob question, although I think that the issue of cultural diversity was an area to focus on a little bit more. So Will did a great job of describing what Rob can do for a good study circle. These include things such as avoiding personalizing disagreements, allowing people to listen and openly express their ideas. As a facilitator, right, you're not meant to share your opinion as much as guide the discussion. So issues of culture and diversity. Some of the ways that this was addressed were a little bit vague, and so this part of the question was harder for some folks. So in terms of responding to address the issues of culture, some things that I think made for really good responses were people who brought up different spectrums of culture, individualism versus collectivism, masculine, feminine, high context, low context, or people who were directly talking about how there's unique challenges of diversity in culture and communication. So if the response was kind of a short, being considerate of other cultures, it didn't really get at some of the ways that culture can directly be addressed in the spectrum. Again, I overall thought these responses were good. Groupthink. So there are some good examples here. A lot of people brought up Pearl Harbor and the inability to sufficiently prepare for that situation as one issue, right? So groupthink is definitely a big problem. And there's a lot of discussions that we've talked about before of how groupthink played out with things like Dave Pink, right? So groupthink, again, things that I was looking for in this definition, and some of the symptoms, right? Symptoms being the characteristics, the things you notice within it. So it's kind of like you go to a doctor, the doctor says, well, it looks like you have a fever, in the same way. The symptom of groupthink might be unquestioned belief in the morality of the group. You're going to have the right decision no matter what. You're going to work together. It could be something like the group members don't let in outsiders or shun or make fun of outside perspectives. So those could be some of the symptoms. And steps to combat groupthink, I think there were some creative ideas here. Giving people more time to talk. A really common strategy brought up was letting in outside perspectives to come to the table and talk about this issue. There's some good stuff here. Negotiation was one of the more recent things that we brought up. So negotiation is distinct because it involves reaching a unanimous or agreed-upon decision among members of the group. So it's not a third party, it's not coercion, it's people having to work together to solve the issue. An ethical negotiator, I think people do a good job of highlighting issues related to, being deceptive, to overweighing certain items under negotiation, to lying about what issues are or are not up for negotiation. Bargaining, so you could, some really good responses compared singly to numerical or non-numerical bargaining, positional versus interest bargaining, and so on. I think the best responses here were ones that address how different styles of bargaining view the parties in conflict differently. Do we think that there's a win-win negotiation available? Or do we feel like one person has to lose for another person to win? And then lastly, deconstructing conflict. The major resources, right, would be your use of evidence through tangible documented evidence, your use of self-reports, and your use of witness reports. Although I also accepted that there are different conflict models could be used to deconstruct conflict. Some resources might be more or less reliable or useful. If you were talking about the like hard evidence, usually tangible evidence is better because people don't have false memory or skewed responses. And then the point of deconstructing a conflict, I really like the idea a lot of people brought in that we can better empathize with and understand opposing views if we deconstruct the conflict and actually engage with what other people are saying and where they're coming from. That's something that you'll hopefully be able to do for your essay. Another thing I liked is this idea that past is prologue. The ability to understand and deconstruct a conflict gives us tools in order to better deconstruct the conflict response. Any questions about the midterm exam, the short essay, multiple choice, or anything else related to this exam? Again, you're welcome to review it again if you'd like, and let me know if there's any questions you'd like clarification on. I overall thought that people did a really solid job. Most people really seem to have a good grasp here. If you're not feeling great, there's a lot of other assignments in the course that will allow you to continue to catch up and do well in class. So we went through that. In the remaining time that we have, I want to bring up a few additional ideas related to aggressiveness and the effects that it can have on communication. We talked last class about how there's both positive elements, our ability to be assertive, to advocate for what we need, and to hold your ground. The argumentative, where you attack the person rather than the issues, and that this can take on destructive approaches. such as hostility, where you're actively seeking to destroy somebody else or destroy somebody's self-concept, and aggressiveness, where you're using force, whether it's physical force, coercion, abuse, and so on, to hurt somebody else. So those four ideas are kind of a major way for us to figure out what makes for good and constructive versus destructive approaches of conflict management. So I went ahead and kind of wanted to map out these different motivation tendencies in your textbooks in this chapter. So there's 5 different models and ways of thinking about how people might choose to engage in conflict or argumentation with other people. And it's defined in terms of 2 spectrums, right? Somebody's willingness or motivation to approach an argument. So if somebody is very strong here, then they really want to get into an argument with somebody else. And then like a motivation to avoid arguments. So it seems like these 2 things are the opposite on paper. There's actually situations where people feel both of those things at once. For instance, a conflicted, feeling moderate, wants to deal with an argument, wants to deal with a fight or issue, but also wants to avoid arguments. A really good example of this would be somebody that's seeking preventive couples counseling. They want to go see a counselor because they don't want to get into arguments or fights with their partner, but they want to make sure that they're addressing and bringing issues to the table so that they can have a constructive dialogue in the future. So these things seem contradictory, but people oftentimes are dealing with these mixed feelings with this in mind. Meanwhile, right, a low argumentative person is somebody that really wants to avoid arguments and really does not try to seek them out either. Right? So they want to avoid arguments. They have no interest in approaching an argument for constructive reason either. Neutral moderate, right, are people who generally are in the middle. You know, if an argument comes up, okay, great. Maybe there's some times where you want to assert yourself and bring up a point of contention, okay. A high argumentative, right, is somebody that really wants to approach and engage in an argument. There's people that like to seek conflict and seek disagreement. So, you know, comment sections on the internet, really good example of high argumentatives. And then at the end here you have apathetic, moderate argumentatives who, you know, again, don't really care about approaching arguments and don't really care about avoiding arguments either. If they happen, they happen, but I don't really care about engaging. So this model helps us to understand that, again, people might choose to approach an argument if they're asserting themselves, if they're trying to resolve a situation, if they feel like it's a good idea to be argumentative and share ideas, but people also might try to avoid arguments, especially in the longer term, especially in terms of things that spill over, right? They brought up on Monday some of the physiological effects, the impacts of anger and resentment that builds over time can be really destructive for relationships. So taking that preventative approach might be a way to approach and feel positively about arguments. I don't know how many folks saw The Favorite, which was a movie that came out a couple of years ago, but it's basically Queen and 2 kind of figures of royalty, the 2 main characters, who are in this like incredibly hostile conflict over trying to be the favorite or to win over the support of the Queen. So this is an example of like hostility, where the 2 characters in question, right, are outright trying to destroy or dismantle the other character. So we see examples of hostility a lot of the time, right? Our fight or flight response is we see a threat, we eliminate it. It doesn't necessarily mean killing, it just means that we're trying to get rid of what we see as the threat, make somebody no longer a threat to us. Oh, you're applying to this job too? I don't think you're a good fit. You should apply somewhere else, right? We can use hostility in other ways like that, passive aggressiveness, and so on. When it comes to verbal aggressiveness, right, aggressiveness is something we might think about in terms of actual physical violence, but it can also be other things. It can attack the competence of somebody, right? That's insulting somebody, saying, oh, I don't think you're right in the head, or making a really like insulting or ableist comment such as that, seems to attack somebody's character. Say, my opponent seems to be a very dishonest person. These types of ad hominem or personal attacks can be really common in a lot of political debates. Aggressive teasing. So if you're ever given like a kind of mocking or mean name, right? This happens all the time, like middle or high school, right? So I had like a bowl cut in middle school, and I got called mophead all the time, right? So an example of aggressive teasing. Maledictions, right, or direct insults, where somebody's directly using language in an offensive way, right? Use of the word gay as like a pejorative insult is hopefully one that we've moved past, but it's one that I heard a lot growing up to describe something people don't like. Also, right, the use of the R word is another one that's gotten a lot of criticism for its impact on folks with disabilities. The use of threats, right? So threatening to do something to somebody they don't comply, coercion is a big issue here. And then nonverbal gestures, right? So flipping somebody the bird, road rage, and so on are two examples of engaging in